You know, it's a funny thing about life. Most of us, we spend our days running a race we didn't even sign up for, chasing after something we think we need. We pile on the hours, stack up the pennies, always convinced that happiness, real security, that stuff is just around the next bend, tied up in the next big pay raise or the fancier car or the bigger house. We squint so hard at the horizon, looking for that elusive treasure, that sometimes we forget to look down, forget to see what we've already got clutched tight in our own two hands. And more often than not, it takes the ground falling out from under our feet to finally make us open our eyes. That was the road Vernon walked, straight and narrow, worn down by the souls of countless others just like him. Vernon Miller. 48 years old, though some days, especially after a particularly long swing shift, he felt every one of those years and then some. A factory man, through and through, had been since the ink on his high school diploma was barely dry. From the clang and hum of the assembly line to the grit that settled deep in your pores, it was all he'd ever truly known. You could see his history etched into him, clear as day. His frame was solid, not bulky with show muscles, but dense with years of practical strength. His back, wide and stooped just slightly, carried the invisible weight of 1,000 shifts, the kind where you lift and push and pull and torque until your muscles scream for mercy, then do it again the next day and the day after that. He moved with a practiced, almost economical rhythm, each step deliberate, no wasted motion, just the steady, heavy gait of someone who knows their body as a tool, honed by repetition, by the relentless demands of the line. The faint smell of grease and metal seemed to cling to his work coat even after it had been washed, a permanent part of him. His hands, now those were the real storytellers. They were big Vernon's hands, with knuckles that looked like weathered stones, permanently stained under the nails, and palms cross-hatched with a map of calluses, ridges, and old scars. A jagged white line ran across his left index finger where a cutting machine had once slipped, another on his thumb from a wrench that had stripped a little too fast. They weren't soft, manicured hands, not by a long shot. These were hands that had built things from raw materials, fixed machines that groaned and seized, provided every single thing his family had ever needed. Hands that could expertly tighten a stubborn bolt with surprising finesse, or deftly guide a fishing line, though they looked far more suited for the former. They were a testament to his unyielding perseverance, a physical ledger of every hour he'd punched, every dollar he'd earned through the sweat of his brow and the ache in his bones. The kind of hands that told you a man had worked hard, had never shirked a duty, and carried the weight of responsibility like a badge of honor. And his face. It wasn't unkind, not really, but it was a map of hard living, a landscape carved by the relentless sun and the unforgiving glow of factory lights. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, not laugh lines so much as squint lines, born of concentration and the strain of early morning sunrises glimpsed through the windshield of his pickup truck. His jaw was set often in a way that spoke of quiet determination, or perhaps a profound, bone-deep weariness that had settled in and made itself at home. His hair, what was left of it, was mostly gray now, cut short and practical like everything else about him. There was a gruffness to his exterior, a sense that he didn't suffer fools gladly, and certainly wasn't one for easy pleasantries or meaningless small talk. He wasn't the kind to slap you on the back and ask how your weekend was, not unless he genuinely cared to hear the answer, and even then his expression wouldn't give much away. He was quiet, observant, soaking up the world around him, processing it all behind a stoic facade that few ever dared to penetrate. But if you looked close, real close, especially in those rare moments when he thought no one was watching, you'd catch a fleeting glimpse in those deep-set, weary eyes, a flicker of something more profound. A quiet watchfulness, an observation of the world around him that went deeper than his silent demeanor suggested. Sometimes, on a rare occasion, when he was looking at Sarah, his wife, the woman who had stood by him for 25 years, or watching his kids, Jessica and Ethan, a hint of tenderness would soften that gruff mask, just for a second, revealing the man beneath. It was a longing for a simple contentment he couldn't quite grasp, and an unwavering loyalty that was the bedrock of his very being. His tiredness wasn't just physical. It was a soul-deep exhaustion, born from the relentless pursuit of more, of providing, of making sure his family never wanted for anything. He carried a heavy burden, the unspoken fear of failure always lurking, a phantom weight that pushed him to work harder longer always, believing his worth was tied directly to his income. He looked like a man who never quit, and never would, even if the relentless grind was killing him slowly from the inside out, inch by weary inch. He was the kind of man you'd find in any small town across America, the backbone of a community, unnoticed but essential, carrying his world on his shoulders with stubborn pride and a silent prayer for enough. Carrying his world on his shoulders with stubborn pride and a silent prayer for enough. It's a prayer a lot of men whisper, isn't it? A silent bargain with the universe. Just a little more. They say a man can spend his whole life climbing, reaching for the next rung, the next dollar, convinced that just around the bend, beyond that next paycheck, lies the promised land of peace and plenty. He builds walls around his family, brick by brick of overtime and sacrifice, thinking he's protecting them, making them safe. But sometimes, in his relentless building, he forgets to put in a window. He forgets to look inside. He gets so good at providing things, he stops providing himself. And for a long, long time, he doesn't see the difference. He confuses comfort with connection, security with presence, and his own worth with his net worth. Until one day the walls come tumbling down, and in the dust and rubble he finally sees, truly sees, what was always there, shining brighter than any gold he ever chased. Vernon's world was a rigid, grinding loop. The 5 a.m. alarm, a raw screech, summoned him. Before sunup, he was already on his feet, strong black coffee his first ritual, a barely tasted toast his second. Then the familiar drive to the dark, hulking factory, where the rhythmic clang and hiss of machinery was the constant soundtrack. He was good at his job, a master of his station, coaxing life from worn-out parts. He worked with a quiet, efficient fury, always pushing, always earning. 5 days a week, often 6, sometimes 7. Bills piled up like unwelcome guests. Jessica's college tuition, Ethan's growing needs, they were a relentless current. Every meager raise felt swallowed by an invisible monster. He'd catch the worry in Sarah's eyes, a silent question he always answered with a gruff, "I got it," then buried himself deeper in overtime. Beneath the grease and fatigue, a different Vernon lay buried. Beneath the grease and fatigue, a different Vernon lay buried. A younger Vernon, maybe, who once dreamt of fixing up old cars in his own garage, not just stamping out widgets on an assembly line. He'd wanted to teach Ethan how to build things with his hands, truly build them, and spend summer evenings on the porch with Sarah, just watching the fireflies. Those dreams had been slowly paved over with concrete and overtime deemed luxuries he couldn't afford. He'd convinced himself that providing a roof and food and tuition was those dreams, just in a more practical, less selfish form. But the gnawing feeling, a faint echo in the quiet moments, told him he'd traded something vital for something merely necessary. He'd swapped presence for provision, and somewhere along the line the joy had leached out. His worth, he'd unknowingly decided, was measured in the heft of his paycheck. Then came the meeting. Not just a regular huddle, but a full-blown assembly, unusual for a Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly yellow glow, reflecting off the pale, anxious faces of his coworkers. Mr. Henderson, the plant manager, stood at the podium, his voice devoid of its usual booming confidence, instead a low, somber drone. Vernon felt it in his gut before Henderson even started speaking. The air thick with dread, the subtle shift in posture of the men around him, a collective tensing. "Unavoidable," Henderson stammered, his eyes darting across the room, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "Restructuring, streamlining, global competition," words, empty words that hit the floor like dead leaves. Then the phrase that twisted Vernon's stomach into a knot. "Massive layoffs." A ripple of murmurs, then a sudden, shocked silence. Henderson began to read names from a list, each one a death knell for a family's security. Vernon listened, his heart thudding a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. He heard Johnson, who was just weeks from retirement. He heard young Mike with a baby on the way. And then, as if a cold hand had reached in and squeezed his very core, he heard his own name. Vernon Miller, 48 years old, 27 years at this plant. Done, just like that. The clanging machinery of his life had stopped. He walked out of that meeting in a daze, the factory floor, usually a blur of motion, now appearing in stark, unsettling detail. Each wrench, each oil stain, each chipped brick seemed to scream its indifference. The drive home was a blur. He found Sarah in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up, sensing the change in him immediately. The gruff exterior was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. "They let me go," he managed, the words catching in his throat. Sarah's knife clattered onto the cutting board. Her eyes, usually warm and steady, now held a fear he hadn't seen since their earliest, leanest days. Not anger, not accusation, just raw, gut-wrenching fear. That look cut deeper than any pink slip. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing bleed. The days blurred into an endless cycle of polished resumes, online applications that vanished into digital black holes, and the same polite, firm rejections. Overqualified. Looking for a different skill set. We went with another candidate. Each email, each phone call felt like another brick chipping away at his self-worth. The bills kept coming. Jessica called, asking about her next tuition payment. Ethan needed new cleats. Sarah worked extra shifts at the diner, her exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The mortgage statement arrived, stark and unforgiving. Then the eviction notice, a brutal white rectangle that landed on the kitchen table like a death sentence. Vernon stood there, staring at it, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He had promised them security. He had promised them safety. He had worked his fingers to the bone, sacrificed sleep, ignored his own soul for this. And now he was losing the very roof over their heads. His carefully constructed world, built on years of endless toil, was crumbling around him. The silence in the house, broken only by the distant sounds of the neighborhood, felt suffocating. He wasn't just a provider who'd failed. He was a failure, pure and simple. What was he without his work? What was he if he couldn't even keep his family in their home? The answer echoed in his empty stomach. Nothing. It was 3 a.m. The house was a tomb. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the dark pressing in around him like a physical weight. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind against the windowpane seemed to whisper his failings. He'd built his life around the hum of machines, the smell of oil, the steady rhythm of a paycheck. Without it, he felt unmoored, adrift in a vast, cold ocean. His mind replayed every missed soccer game, every quiet dinner where he'd been physically present but mentally miles away, calculating overtime, stressing about the next bill. He remembered Jessica's shy smile when he'd managed to make it to her school play, then the quick shame that he hadn't been there for so many others. Ethan, growing up too fast, their conversations often limited to how was school, and a grunt in response. He'd given them things, a comfortable house, food on the table, opportunities he hadn't had. But what had he withheld? Himself. He saw the fear in Sarah's eyes, magnified in the darkness. He felt the cold truth of his children's disappointment, even if unspoken. He had tried so hard to be the rock, the unshakable foundation, and now he was just sand, dissolving. The stubborn pride he'd worn like armor had kept him from asking for help, from admitting he was struggling long before the layoffs. It had convinced him that the burden was his alone, that vulnerability was weakness. A single tear tracked a path down his temple, tasting of salt and dust. He'd confused his purpose with his production. He'd chased a ghost, accumulating money he thought would buy happiness, only to find it could disappear in an instant, leaving him with nothing. And in that nothing, in that stark, agonizing void, he saw the real, brutal truth. He had lost everything he thought mattered, and in doing so he finally, truly understood what he had taken for granted. He was worthless, he thought, utterly worthless. And the worst part was, he had nobody to blame but the man staring blankly back at him from the dark reflection in the window. He was worthless, he thought, utterly worthless. And the worst part was, he had nobody to blame but the man staring blankly back at him from the dark reflection in the window. The cold glass gave no comfort, only an unflinching mirror to his ruin. The weight of it all, the crushing, suffocating weight, pressed down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. For 48 years, Vernon had always known what to do. Work harder, push through, provide. But now the blueprint was shredded, the foundation cracked, and the very ground beneath him had given way. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't just physical fatigue from the endless shifts. It was a soul weariness, a depletion that went down to the marrow. He tried everything he knew how to do, and it had brought him here to this dark kitchen, this empty well of despair. He had nothing left to give, no more strategies to deploy, no more fight to summon for the phantom chase. Slowly, deliberately, Vernon pushed himself up from the chair. The creak of the floorboards sounded like a protest in the silent house. He walked to the sink, turned on the tap, letting the cold water run over his hands. He watched the clear stream swirl down the drain, taking with it, he hoped, some of the grime, some of the burden. He looked at his reflection in the water pooling on the stainless steel, distorted and shimmering. It was a face he barely recognized anymore, etched with worry, hollowed by defeat. Then, from somewhere deep inside, a voice, quiet but firm, cut through the din of his self-condemnation. It wasn't a roar, not a dramatic declaration. It was just a breath, a barely audible whisper against the current of his despair. Enough chasing. Enough pretending. Enough carrying the world on his shoulders when his shoulders were breaking. Enough confusing what he did with who he was. He didn't know what came next. Didn't have a plan. Didn't have a job, much less a way to stop the bank from taking the house. He had no answers for the mounting bills, for Jessica's college tuition, for Ethan's future. All he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, was that he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep being that Vernon, the one who worked himself to the bone for a definition of success that had proven to be a cruel mirage. That Vernon was broken beyond repair. This absolute crushing rock bottom, it was a finish line of sorts, a terrible, agonizing end to one way of living. The first sliver of dawn, a gray, hesitant light, began to seep through the kitchen window, chasing away the deepest shadows. Vernon stood there, unmoving, watching the world slowly wake. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the familiar knot of anxiety still clenched his stomach. His first instinct, a lifetime of habit, was to start planning, to scramble for a solution, to find a way to fix what was broken. But the word enough echoed. He didn't turn on the news, didn't pick up the phone, didn't even make himself a cup of coffee. Instead, with a quiet deliberation that felt foreign to him, he walked out of the kitchen, through the small living room and down the short hallway to the bathroom. He took a long, hot shower, letting the steam fill the small space, trying to wash away more than just the night's sweat. He shaved slowly, carefully, a task he'd often rushed through in the frantic mornings. He looked at his face in the mirror again, still tired, still worn, but something was different around the eyes. A quiet stillness, a surrender that felt almost like strength. When he emerged, the house was stirring. He heard Sarah in the kitchen, the soft clink of ceramic. He walked in, not with his usual harried stride, but with a pace that felt almost deliberate. Sarah looked up, her own face etched with worry, but surprised to see him. Usually, he'd already be halfway through his coffee, mentally calculating the day's production quotas, a distant look in his eyes. "Morning," she said, her voice soft, tentative. "Morning, Sarah," he replied, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't just grunt. He met her gaze, held it, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable passing between them. Then he did something else that was completely out of his recent character. He walked over to the cabinet, pulled down 2 mugs, and started brewing a fresh pot of coffee, not just for himself, for them both. Ethan stumbled into the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, heading straight for the cereal box. Vernon watched him for a moment, the gangly teenager, a whirlwind of energy he often missed. He thought about the factory, the deafening noise, the endless repetition. He thought about the stack of bills on the counter, the letter from the bank. The panic tried to surge, a familiar venom in his veins. But then he looked at Sarah, pouring the fresh coffee, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. He looked at Ethan, obliviously munching cereal, completely dependent on the stability Vernon had always strived to provide. The lesson from the deep, dark pit of last night wasn't about finding a new job, not yet. It was about showing up. It was about being present. It was about realizing that this moment right here, right now, with his family around him, was the one thing no layoff, no bank, no amount of debt could take away. He took a deep breath, the smell of coffee and toast filling his senses. "Ethan," he said, his voice a little rough but clear. The boy looked up, surprised. "What are you working on in history these days?" It was a simple question, mundane even. But for Vernon, it was a chasm crossed, a silent pledge made. It was day 1, and it was harder than any double shift he'd ever pulled. But he did it. That first day, Vernon found himself watching the clock, a habit hardwired from decades on the factory floor. Except now, there was no whistle, no conveyor belt, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. He helped Sarah with the dishes, an act so foreign to his usual routine that his hands felt clumsy with the sponge. He listened to Ethan recount a history lesson about ancient Rome, nodding, trying to absorb every word, even when his mind kept drifting back to the stack of past-due notices on the kitchen table. He resisted the urge to sneak glances at job boards, telling himself, "Later, just later." It was a constant internal wrestling match, every fiber of his being itching to do something, fix something, earn something. But he held himself to the silent promise he'd made. He was here. He was present. And by the time the kids were off to school and Sarah was heading out for her part-time gig at the library, Vernon felt more exhausted than if he'd just pulled a triple shift. Day 3 arrived, bringing with it a chilling stillness that felt heavier than the first. The house, usually an oasis of quiet retreat after a grueling shift, now felt like a cage. He tried the history talk again with Ethan that morning, but his mind kept wandering. He heard the forced cheer in his own voice, the emptiness of the questions he asked. Ethan, sensing the distraction, just shrugged and went back to his phone. Vernon felt the old familiar shame creep in, the gnawing sensation that he was failing even at this. He caught himself staring at the stack of bills, then at the empty spot on the wall where his framed factory service awards used to hang, packed away in a box somewhere in the basement, too painful to look at. A knot formed in his gut. What was he even doing? Sitting around pretending to care about Roman emperors while his world crumbled. This wasn't providing. This was just idling. His hands, usually busy fixing things, were idle. His mind, usually calculating overtime hours, was empty or worse, filled with worry. He paced from the living room to the kitchen to the front porch, the silence amplifying the thrum of his anxiety. He almost grabbed his car keys, almost drove to the usual haunts, the old diner where the guys hung out, just to feel like he was doing something familiar, something that made him feel like Vernon again. But he stopped himself, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He had made a promise, not just to Sarah and the kids, but to himself. He stood there for a long time, just breathing before turning away from the door. By day 7, the novelty had worn thin, replaced by a relentless grind. The job applications, sent out in weary batches each afternoon, yielded nothing but automated rejections, if anything at all. The bank called, a polite but firm voice reminding them about the mortgage. Vernon felt the panic closing in tighter than ever before. He snapped at Sarah over burnt toast, then immediately regretted it, the look of hurt in her eyes a fresh wound. He retreated to the garage, the familiar scent of oil and old wood a small comfort. He picked up an ancient wrench, a useless gesture, but it felt good to hold something solid, something with purpose. He started tinkering with an old, broken lawnmower, a neighbor's discard, just to have something to focus on. It was a physical task, a problem to solve, a way to channel the restless energy that churned inside him. But even there, the thoughts found him. You're just hiding, Vernon. You should be out there making calls, knocking on doors, doing something that matters. This isn't enough. He wanted to quit not just the lawnmower, but the whole charade of showing up. What good was he doing? He was a burden, a failure. He slammed the wrench down on the workbench, the clang echoing in the sudden quiet. He slumped onto an old stool, burying his face in his hands. He could feel the despair clawing at him, trying to drag him back down into that dark pit. He imagined himself just staying there in the garage, letting the days bleed into weeks, useless and broken. But then he heard it, Sarah's gentle voice from the kitchen door, asking if he wanted a sandwich. A simple question, an outstretched hand. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and saw not pity but concern and something else. Unwavering love. It wasn't conditional on his income, on his success, on his current usefulness. It was just there. In that moment, the stubborn pride that had always made it hard for him to ask for help, the same stubbornness that kept him going on endless shifts, now turned its gaze inward. He wouldn't quit. He couldn't. He picked up the wrench again, his grip firm. Day 14 arrived, a milestone of sorts, and Vernon felt like he'd been through a war. He'd had more conversations with Ethan about homework, more quiet moments with Sarah over coffee than he had in the last 5 years combined. Each one was a small victory, a tiny chip knocked off the thick wall he'd built around himself. But the old demon still whispered. The fear of failure, the fear of not providing, the ingrained belief that his worth was tied to his productivity, they were relentless. He still woke at 3 a.m. sometimes, staring at the ceiling, the numbers running through his head, the weight of their precarious situation pressing down. He almost gave in, almost went back to his old habits, snapping into a foul mood, retreating into silence, letting the stress consume him. There was an argument with Jessica over her college tuition, a brief, sharp exchange that left both of them stinging. He'd yelled, something he rarely did, the pressure finally exploding. "You don't understand, Jess," he'd bellowed, immediately regretting the words as he saw her face crumple. He spent the next few hours in bitter silence, convinced he'd ruined everything, proven himself to be the same absent, angry man he'd been before. But later that evening, when she came to him, a quiet apology in her eyes, he didn't deflect, didn't walk away. He pulled her into a hug, the awkwardness of it a testament to how long it had been, and just held her. No grand pronouncements, no promises of money he didn't have. Just a father holding his daughter. It was in that embrace, that clumsy, heartfelt connection, that he realized something profound. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there. It was about weathering the storms, even the ones he created himself, and still choosing to show up. He was still fighting, yes, but the battlefield was shifting. It wasn't just about fighting against the world anymore. It was about fighting for them, and in doing so, fighting for himself. This shift wasn't a sudden sunrise. It was more like the slow, steady pull of the tide. The next morning, Vernon still felt the old urge to retreat to let the bitterness fester, but something held him back. Instead of burying himself in the newspaper want ads, he made Sarah a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her, just watching the steam curl. He didn't say much, just, "Morning." But the quiet companionship, the simple act of being there, was a foreign luxury. He started small. Ethan's old bike had a flat sitting in the garage for months. Vernon spent an afternoon patching it, his hands, once accustomed to heavy machinery, now deftly working the rubber and glue. He didn't announce it, just left it by the back door, tires pumped, chain oiled. Ethan found it after school, a surprised grin spreading across his face, and Vernon, watching from the kitchen window, felt a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. It wasn't about the money for a new tire, or even the time saved by fixing it himself. It was about seeing the boy's face, about the simple act of care. Sarah started to notice, too. He wasn't bringing home stacks of cash, but he was bringing home his presence. He'd sit on the porch swing with her after dinner, no TV blaring, just the sounds of crickets and the occasional car passing. He listened when she talked about her day, truly listened, instead of just nodding absently while his mind raced with budgets and bills. One evening, she reached out and took his hand, her touch hesitant, then firm. "You're different, Vern," she murmured, her eyes searching his. He didn't have a grand explanation. "Just trying to be here," he mumbled, a little embarrassed, but not pulling away. The job hunt was still a grind. He went to interviews, applied online, faced rejection after rejection. The old Vernon would have spiraled, seeing each "no" as proof of his worthlessness. This Vernon felt the sting, sure, but he didn't let it define him. He knew his worth wasn't tied to an income, not anymore. He volunteered at the local soup kitchen a couple of afternoons a week, pushing a broom, washing dishes. Didn't pay the bills, but it filled something inside him, a quiet sense of purpose that money couldn't buy. Weeks turned into a couple of months. The worry about losing the house was still a gnawing fear, but it no longer consumed him. He was no longer a prisoner of it. Then a call came, not for a factory floor manager or a high-skill machinist, but for a maintenance man at the community center down the road. It was less pay, significantly less, but it was steady. It was close. And it came with a key to the building, a sense of trust. Vernon took it. No hesitation, no internal debate about prestige or income potential. It was honest work, and it meant he could be home by 5. His new routine became his anchor. He'd still wake early, but now it was to make coffee, sometimes to walk around the block, just watching the neighborhood wake up. When Ethan left for school, Vernon would walk him part of the way, talking about nothing and everything. Afternoons were spent fixing a leaky faucet, patching a wall, helping with the summer programs at the center. It was simple work, practical, and it gave him a quiet satisfaction he'd forgotten existed. Evenings were the biggest change. The TV wasn't always on. There were board games with Ethan, card games with Sarah, long conversations with Jessica over the phone about her classes, her friends, her future. He even started puttering in the small garden patch in the backyard, something he'd always meant to do but never had the time for. He planted tomatoes, basil, a few pepper plants. His hands, still rough and scarred from years of factory work, now gently coaxed life from the soil. He looked tired, yes, the lines on his face still etched deep from a lifetime of labor, but the worry in his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He wasn't chasing, he was living. One Sunday, as they sat around the old kitchen table, eating the spaghetti Sarah had made, the kind they hadn't had much of when money was tight, Vernon looked at them all. Sarah, her face relaxed, a small smile playing on her lips. Jessica, home for the weekend, laughing at something Ethan said. Ethan, elbow deep in pasta, looking up at him with genuine affection. The house was still small, still a little worn. The bills were still there, always there, but they were manageable. They were making it work, and Vernon, for the first time in a long time, felt a profound sense of peace. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused aloud, startling them slightly. They all looked at him. "Spent nearly 50 years of my life chasing after something I already had. Thought I needed more money, a bigger house, a fancy car, to prove I was worth something. To prove I could provide." He shook his head, a small, sad smile. "Lost the house, damn near lost my mind, thought I lost everything, and that's when I finally saw it." He looked from Sarah to Jessica, then to Ethan. "I had everything that mattered right here, all along." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, weighted with the truth of his journey. "Family," he said, his voice a little gruff. "It ain't about what you can buy 'em, it's about showing up. It's about sitting at this table, even when there ain't much on it. It's about listening, even when you got nothing to fix. It's about being present. That's the real provision. And so, the man who once believed his worth was measured in overtime hours and dollar signs found his true fortune in the quiet moments, in the laughter across a dinner table, in the feel of earth in his hands, in the simple, undeniable truth of being there. He learned that some of the deepest wells of life aren't found by digging deeper into the earth, but by simply turning around and looking at what was always right beside him. Sometimes